Welcome to everybody. I'm Emma Crewe. I'm a researcher at SOAS, University of London, and I'm also chair of the RAI's Committee on the Anthropology of Policy and Practice, which is hosting this series, which is called Anthropology Communicates. And the purpose of the committee is to promote anthropological research and help non-anthropologists understand how we do research and why it is very rigorous and can reveal things that are often concealed, for example. But we're also interested as a committee and in this series to promote dialogue between anthropologists in academia, in consultancy companies, in civil society, in government, and wherever else they might work. So we're really interested in promoting dialogue and debate. So we've got a monthly series. This is the third in the series. So please do check the RAI website for other events in the series. On a very techie practical note, we're all learning how to be Zoomers, and Zoom changes. So I've noticed two things lately. One is that Macs have their raised hand button in reactions at the bottom of the screen on the right, not in participants. So if you're a Mac user, you may find that your raised hand function has changed. And the other thing I've noticed is more of a kind of social phenomena, which is that it's really fantastic for the speakers to have what we've now got, which is a lovely sea of people and friendly faces. And so we certainly can't insist that everyone keeps their camera on. You absolutely, it's very understandable if some people want to keep it off, but it's lovely if enough people keep it on so that we've got a whole page as we have now. So I'm really grateful to be able to see real people rather than sort of, that eerie business of talking to a blank screen. So that's fantastic. Anyway, so today we are going to hear about the experience of working in humanitarian work and international development from three anthropologists. And I'm going to introduce all three and then ask each to speak for about 10 minutes each. And then we'll have a broad discussion where we invite anyone to ask questions, share their own experiences, disagree politely, or make comments and so forth. So I need to begin with the legendary Professor Raymond Apthorpe, who has been a joy to work with for many years. And I first knew Raymond before he knew me, because I was very influenced by his work on policy, the anthropology of policy. It's been extremely useful ever since. It had a very profound influence on me. It is impossible to summarize Raymond's work. He's had academic posts in so many places, including Oxford, SOAS, LSE, UEA, Australia, many more. He's worked as a consultant for a whole range of organizations. And very importantly, he was once stuck in Bhutan for 6 months and trained the national tennis team. So there is much more to know about Raymond, but I just simply don't have time to go into it. The second speaker will be Amy Croome, who I've also known for a few years. Amy is the influencing and communicating manager at Oxfam and works in Somaliland and Somalia. Before that, she worked in Myanmar. She's trained and other places. She's trained as an anthropologist at SOAS, and she's really interested in understanding social and gender justice. And then we'll hear from Alex Fenwick, who is the head of programs at WHH in Somaliland. Alex was also trained in anthropology at SOAS, and he's really interested in data-driven approaches, along with many other aspects of research and management. So I'd like to hand over to Raymond. Raymond, you have a sort of generous 10 minutes. So I look forward very much to giving you the chance to tell us about some of your experiences. But we need you to reveal yourself again and unmute.
Is that all right?
We can't see you. You've unmuted. Oh no, you've muted again. Luckily, we've got plenty of time. Yes, we have you. We have you. We can see you, but you've muted. The mute button is the on the far left at the bottom. Right, perfect.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, 10 minutes.
Oh, good. Okay. Emma, thanks for an extraordinary introduction. Legends are dead, I think. And so far as I know, I'm not yet quite dead. I'm not sure that the Bhutan tennis team didn't teach me more than I taught them. However, it was very nice being there. And for a while, when I was in the east of Bhutan, that was my relaxation. I had two things to pass the time by. One, flea fever, which is very difficult to deal with. And the other was coaching the tennis team, which was very easy and very pleasant. However, I don't really want to, at least not at this stage of the proceedings, I don't want to talk too much about my own background. I want really to kind of introduce the subject and then suggest that although huge progress has been made over the last 50 or 60 years, really huge. If you go back, to IDS at University of Sussex in the 1960s, it was a struggle if you were not an economist. Well, in fact, the only identity you were given then was not an anthropologist or a sociologist, you were a non-economist. And from that sort of negative identity, there wasn't much you could do. And what you were expected to do was only at the margins, nothing central, only a few social aspects. Now, since those times, so very much has changed, and then really interdisciplinarity was perhaps not even an aspiration, but there was certainly very little of it. Institutes that call themselves interdisciplinary institutes of development studies were not. But that's another thing that's changed very considerably since then. And one might perhaps focus on gender studies, also environmental studies, which really were interdisciplinary from the beginning. Humanitarian studies as well, contrasted with development studies. By the way, today I'm going to talk more about, I think we are going to talk more about development studies. We have a session in September on humanitarian studies. There are similarities, but I think there are some differences as well. Now, if I could sum up, which of course you can't in one sentence, but I'm now going to try to do that. What has anthropology, or not specifically anthropologists, but anybody with an anthropological perspective, anybody who, is so inclined to take an anthropological point of view, whether a trained anthropologist or not, is there one theme really that's come through over the last 60 years? I think there is. And I would like to sum it up, again, slightly contrasting anthropology and development with economics and development, because you can't avoid that if you're talking history just for a few moments. And while economists were talking forever about capacity building, particularly in the Amartya Sen tradition, the anthropologists who were involved were not talking about capacity building as the key area that intellectual work and practical work should focus on. It was not capacity building, it was barrier lowering. The barriers to the capacities which already existed and which anthropologists or anthropologically inclined research could find very easily were shut out. They had no access. And I think that's what came through from that anthropology and development of those days, that the capacities were there. Of course, you can always send people to universities. There's always a chance for further development of a capacity, but there were enough capacities there to make it more important to lower barriers to those capacities being used than putting all the emphasis on capacity building. That I'd like to suggest is the one thing that I think is common to all the areas of anthropology and development over the last few years, over the first, say, 50 or 60 years. I'm taking the 1960s as a kind of starting point for this discussion. What you couldn't do then, but what we do now, as in the title of today's panel, is to put UN bodies and NGOs together in the same basket. There was then a great divide between the two. You couldn't really talk about them at the same time. And if ever you met anybody working for the UNDP, again, somewhere else, she would be working this time for a non-governmental organization. And the staff were completely interchangeable, but so were the ideas. And when there was a great divide between these two types of organizations, I'm talking about the biggest ones rather than big and the small, the biggest ones of each category, such that one was almost alternative to the other, that's gone. This is something we may very well want to discuss. We may not agree on this, at least not very much. We may agree a little, but not enough. But it seems to me that the distinction there used to be between so-called civil society and these big corporate societies have gone. I think it's all corporate. If you like, there's civil and non-civil, or UN and non-UN, but there's no longer a great divide. Where I see the variation is not across the divide, but on either side of what used to be the divide. So in fact, it becomes very difficult to generalize either about UN bodies. I mean, the UNDP and the ILO and WHO, very, very difficult to generalize about them. And also on the other side, it's very difficult to generalize about, for example, Oxfam and MSF and Amnesty International, all of which I've worked for in the past. They're different. And that I think is something that we'll have to consider and probably will come up in the discussion. The big distinction seems to have gone. What we have now are all sorts of different organizations, doesn't matter whether they're governmental or non-governmental, a huge degree of variation. And I really would suggest that the old theories of civil society, the old talk about civil society is no longer valid. If the idea was then, and if it is to become again, to make a contrast between the two. So please don't read from the title of today's session that, which is a mission to achieve, to be achieved, that shouldn't be read to suggest that nothing has been achieved before. A great deal has been achieved, and that's why I started with just those few remarks about 50 years of history. Position I'm taking now, just to introduce the panel, is that nevertheless, there's still a great way to go. There's a great deal to be done. And this is going to require, in particular, a change, a development, a new stage in anthropology. Of course, it takes two to tango and two not to tango. And it's not only anthropology that needs to change, it's probably also the management consultancy way of communication, which is also up for discussion in this panel today. Today, we're talking about the kind of communication that anthropology looks for through management consultancies, either to non-governmental or governmental organizations. And I think we should remember, before mentioning one point about the type of contract, because I think not only anthropology might change, needs to change to move on a bit, but also the kind of contracts that are available as management consultancy on development to these big organizations. But before that, remember, I think, when you are an advisor, to remain an advisor, you shouldn't be a ruler. You shouldn't try to be a would-be ruler. Advising and ruling are quite different. And advisors who try to become rulers, they might become good rulers, but they're no longer advisors. And I want to still keep, for the time being, anthropology in an advisory role. An anthropologist or an anthropologically inclined person hired as an advisor, short of wanting to be a ruler. This means a change, one particular change in the type of contract, because currently the management consultancy contracts, they ask for single best solutions. When you come to your recommendations, you're supposed to come up with a bottom line recommendation. That, I suggest, is more like ruling than advising. In my own experience, which I don't want to talk about very much, I've always found it possible to negotiate the terms of reference. If you do that right at the very beginning. And I know particularly from John Borton, who's with us today, that that's absolutely the case. In fact, it's even more the case now than it used to be. Terms of reference can be negotiated, much more so than in the past. And in negotiating them, that gives a chance for anthropology, in fact, to be more advisory by being more conjectural. And instead of coming up with bottom line solutions, the single best thing to do, which is a ruling decision rather than an advisory decision, it could come up instead with menus of options, that if an agency does this, then A, then B is likely to be the consequences. But you can't come up with a menu of options at the end of a contract. You have to either negotiate that at the beginning, or you're stuck with the bottom line would-be ruling decision requirement. You can't change it without, in fact, breaking up the whole agreement, the whole contract. The other thing I want to say about these contracts is they are really, there's the terms of reference, there's the second part, which are findings. It's very seldom research. They're findings. They're not research findings. They're findings of, maybe a connoisseur might comment on. A friend of mine a long time ago, Christine Sylvester, said these are not findings, they're sightings. The best you can hope for, usually, when you're working on such a contract, is not research findings, but a few sightings. And I think for anthropologists to say, well, there wasn't enough time to do research, that's a rather unimpressive way out. It's rather irresponsible and unaccountable, because it wasn't research in the first place that you were hired to do. So to say that, if anthropologists say, well, there wasn't enough time to do my research, well, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about another sort of communication of anthropology through management consultancies. Now, just to wind up then, there is something to be thought about in terms of the mode of communication we're talking about, management consultancy. But I just want to say that also anthropology has done very well so far. That's not to be denied. But looking ahead, it needs to change, I think, in 2 or 3 particular ways. I'll just take 2 for the time being. I'm probably running out of my first 10 minutes. The first is to be differently ethnographic from what it has been thus far. And what I mean by that is, if we take, for example, the culture of people and place that was formerly unknown, and partly the reason for the anthropological involvement is to do some ethnography about what was unknown about place and people, we need to go a little bit beyond that. It's still to be ethnographic, but to be differently ethnographic. If you think of what's happened in anthropology, anthropology of language went into anthropology of discourse. And most anthropologists now, when teaching in development or humanitarian studies, come to humanitarian studies in September, find that discourse analysis is exactly the way to go to capture your audience. It also gives you a kind of reason to be in the teaching position, which otherwise is very difficult sometimes to justify in those conditions. I think we have to now go from language to discourse to message analysis. And about, if we stick with culture as an example, it's not what culture is, it's what messages about culture are around, what messages the anthropologist wants to make, and how to analyze the messages rather than the culture. The messages, they didn't necessarily, they're not always about culture, but they very often, because of the way in which ethnography has become so strongly characteristic of this field, it's very often about culture. Now, message analysis, anthropology at the moment does almost nothing on message analysis. I mean, those of us who use the discourse analysis are getting towards that. We talk about naming and framing, coding and counting. As I mean, my Cambridge class is sick and tired of me reciting these 4 wild horses of the apocalypse, that if you can't ride, you can't do anything. But it's that's the point. You have to move from language and discourse to the message. And you have to link up with the present, trends of truth and post-truth, facts or alternative facts. It was so much easier 60 years ago. You were either subjective or objective. If you were using indicators, they were either objective or subjective. Forget all that. It's no longer helpful. The subjectivity, objectivity is no longer the point. There are many more issues now which come up under the truth and post-truth agenda. And therefore anthropology has to become an anthropology of communication. It won't communicate until it is also an anthropology of communication. Then it will communicate better, and then we will be able to move to a kind of new stage. And lastly, the second point, I probably have exceeded my time. Can I have one more point?
Yes, you may.
Okay, I do apologize, everybody. I know there's many, many people with lots of questions and contributions waiting. The second point is Anthropology still doesn't have a comparative method. And yet, I don't know, when you were students, when I was a student, when you are students, you were told anthropology is comparative sociology. But how it can be comparative anything without a comparative method, it might not have mattered very much before. It now matters very much. Why? Because if you can't be methodical about comparison in anthropology, the very interesting comparisons that anthropologists make are read by the managers as cultural relativism and are therefore dismissed. And if you want to communicate anthropology, you don't want to be dismissed out of hand by being misunderstood right from the beginning. That's all. Just a few words. I'm sorry I've gone on too long to open the discussion for the panel. It's a huge panel, so I apologize to all panel members for having kept them waiting, and also the next two speakers. Thank you, Emma.
Raymond, that was absolutely fantastic. I'm sure we will want to come back to your point at the end about comparative method. That seems to me extremely important. So I encourage people to ask questions about that or make comments about that. I certainly think we should come back to that after we've heard from the other two. I'm also very puzzled and intrigued by your statement that we should be advising, not ruling. So I look forward to debating that. I would take a different position. I would say that actually anthropology and anthropological training gives you some very interesting skills which are extremely relevant to the process of ruling or managing. One of them is an obsession about relationships. Another is an interest in difference. And the third is a kind of creativity about how you find out what's going on. And I think these are all very interesting in the process of management. So I look forward to debating that as well. And I say that partly because I think both Amy and Alex are kind of ruling in a way. So that's a perfect moment to hand over to Amy. So Amy, please tell us about your experiences.
Thanks so much. Pleasure to be here, and a bit daunting to speak after Raymond. At first, I didn't think I had much to say on this topic, and then I started noting things down, and now I'm way over the 10 minutes. So I'm going to just try and summarize some of my thoughts. The question of how can anthropologists communicate effectively to humanitarian and development organizations, I thought what would be useful to look at is from what position that anthropologist is speaking. So as a staff on the inside, as a consultant, or someone from the outside, someone who's working within academia, say. So on the inside, what I would suggest is that anthropologists can communicate effectively in the inbuilt moments of reflection within an organizational process. So that may be at the point at which strategies are reviewed, new strategies are developed, a program or approach is evaluated, a new program or project is designed, but also at the moments of crisis that happen within an organization or within a sector, that opens up possibilities for kind of an anthropological lens to be heard and be sought out. So, for example, the conversations on racism within the development and humanitarian sector triggered by Black Lives Matter. The other way might be to speak from other stakeholders' perspectives. So people who are working within the organizations, we are centering ourselves, our projects, our timelines, our budgets. We need to get things done quickly. And that means that sometimes our perspective gets narrower and we just need to get things done. So to disrupt that, for example, if you're trying to make the case for the need for humanitarian organizations to better coordinate in different locations, you could bring in the perspective of the agency of the so-called beneficiary who has managed to get themselves on several cash beneficiary lists. Because why wouldn't you? If you were a displaced person living in a camp and there's an uncoordinated group of NGOs trying to support you, you would make the most of that opportunity. And that might make the case for an organization who is more narrowly understanding their work to step out of that. In the same way, you could bring in different perspectives or understand that the picture, the issues that you're working on are broader than what your organization can manage, and that it would be a good idea to bring in strategic partners. So an organization or individuals who may see the issue and approach it differently, to partner with them, to listen to the way that they see the issue, to understand what they think is needed, and to operate in a partnership with them. The other way on the inside is to, of course, encourage anthropological methodologies in research or evaluations and assessments. As consultants, Raymond already touched on a few of these options. So consultants may be hired as researchers, so as ethnographers, or as management consultants or as evaluators, but they may also be hired as co-creators of something innovative or of kind of a disruptive moment within the sector or the organization. As outsiders, anthropologists are already communicating, but I would say that the opportunities of research or opinions being read is greatly improved if the publications are condensed and published in kind of mainstream development and humanitarian media outlets such as DevX or the New Humanitarian or LinkedIn, because that's what people read, rather than browsing a whole PhD, for example. And also as maybe to co-write or co-research with well-known or well-respected practitioners within the sector who have big networks of people who will likely trust whatever they're going to write or research, and will read it as a consequence. So you have the advantage of being able to disperse your anthropological insight through their networks by partnering with them. And then the other is, again, those jumping in on the moments of crisis where there's questioning and doubt, and practitioners looking outside for insights and new perspectives. So that might be invited as a panelist, or writing some critical questions in a media outlet, or approaching organizations who seem to be or are likely struggling with certain questions. On what role can anthropological knowledge play in shaping policy and practice? Just a couple of thoughts on that. I think this comes back to that advisor versus ruler question, but often people who are hired within the industry, especially expats or foreigners, are hired as technical experts in WASH or gender or micro business development or whatever it may be. And they are often hired into leadership positions within hierarchical structures. They're paid more, and that means that there are expectations on them to have the answers and to know what to do. And I think that someone maybe with an anthropological training could push against that and make adequate space for contextualization, for integrating local knowledge, for listening, despite being sought out as the person who has the answers. I think the other role that it can play is to embed policy analysis within longer term trends. So, for example, the localization debate within the humanitarian sector can be seen as something that fits in with the longer term anti-racist, anti-colonial movements and narrative and discourse around that. Then the other role could be that, I mean, for my work for advocacy and lobbying, a lot of it depends on understanding networks, relationships, and which allies to work with, and how power works within a network of different actors to develop appropriate strategies and tactics to influence them. So that may be understanding practice through observing other people operating in that space. I think Raymond, this is one of the four things that you mentioned to your Cambridge students on framing and narrative and language. I think that is definitely something that someone with an anthropological training is maybe more attuned to analyzing and also using as a way to reframe debates. So that, for example, I was speaking to someone from UN OCHA, and we were discussing the same issue, but I was talking about the triple nexus and she was talking about durable solutions, which are different discourses or different approaches. But I noted that if I want to convince her on something in future, I will be using her term durable solutions rather than mine, because it will feel more familiar to her. But also that it can be useful. It can be a useful way to test how to communicate research findings or research sightings. For example, I was talking to colleagues and partners about humanitarian, about how few women work in humanitarian sector in Somalia, and the reactions were disbelief of the data quality, or that it wasn't important because we should be focusing on the community level. So that kind of understanding those reactions helps to reframe the narrative of those findings to better land with the audience. So yeah, hopefully that outlines some of the possibilities for communications. I would say that the limits is that the demand for anthropology or for anthropologists remains limited in my understanding. I'm not hired as an anthropologist. I'm just hired as someone who has experience in the sector and a degree. But that from what I've noticed, a lot of that interest comes from people who are anthropologists or have taken courses in anthropology and understand what it can offer. So then those people on the inside may be the ones who encourage listening to anthropologists. Yeah, and then the other limit is just the different ways of how much time and how much exchange is needed. That the timelines for research are wildly different between, a year of ethnographic studies versus 2 weeks of doing some data collection. Yeah, that poses some inherent issues. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was completely fascinating. I am really intrigued to know more about what it's like to be an anthropologist, in what way you're being anthropological when you're doing your work in a kind of very day-to-day real experience kind of way. That I would find that very fascinating later if you felt like talking about that. But I'm also interested in this point you made about who's included in coalitions and who you work with. I think it's really interesting that Oxfam has a commitment to gender justice And so all programs have to include women's organizations. Wouldn't it be great if we could insist and make obligatory that any development initiative had to include an anthropologist? Because it is very difficult to communicate from the outside. And so I partly say this just to be provocative to Raymond, that, you know, that would be a lovely rule, because the way to learn really is to work with people in practice. But we'll get on to all that in a minute. And I encourage people to start putting questions in the chat or comments, or give me advance warning that you'd like to speak. If you put the questions in the chat, then I'll ask them on your behalf. If you raise your virtual hand, then I'll invite you to speak in a minute. Meantime, could we hear from our last speaker, Alex? Please tell us about your experiences.
Thanks, and hi everyone. Yeah, a quick bit of context on me. I'm the head of programs for WHH in Hargeisa in Somaliland, and I work in a program that's broadly split between humanitarian and development. And most of our work is with WFP, so that's where I interface with the UN system as well. As Emma mentioned, I have an anthropology background, but I tend to sort of claim professional interest more in data-driven approaches, and that kind of evidence. I guess evidence is something I return to, and that's partly from having spent some long years as a database administrator and working in quantitative monitoring and evaluation, but partly because of the currency that sort of I find quantitative approaches have in the cut and thrust of the aid industry. So I've kind of strategically ridden that wave. It's a bit of a bias I have. I found those approaches to help me get ahead. But echoing what Amy was saying, that's also part and parcel of the lack of everyday demand for anthropology in the industry. I think it helps us to distinguish between what we as anthropologists can offer as a service to the implementation of projects, again in the cut and thrust, and then what we offer the industry more broadly, or at a step removed at the policy level. And I was thinking about this, and I'm thinking that the only sort of offering I've ever come across, or the default offering that anthropology has and has offered for some years, is just qualitative research methods, specifically limited, short-term, and often not ethnography, but sort of lighter, diffused or boiled down versions of ethnography. But as a service, part of the implementation of projects, are very much part of that sort of day-to-day delivery of the NGO industry, rather than more broadly at the policy side. That's what anthropologists do, and I agree with Amy again that we don't do it very much. I've only once in my career hired an anthropologist, and I was wondering if that might be because anthropologists tend to come from the global north, and we within NGOs tend to hire people from the global south. I also think it's because anthropologists tend to work with evidence, or to aspire to work with evidence, whereas projects under the time pressure of implementation, we tend to look for justification, and we can maybe return to the distinction between those things. So I think we have some way to go in terms of delivering our really basic offering of sort of ethnographic methods as a service to the industry, and I think that makes it a bit premature of us to discuss how we can go further, or what the other ways are that anthropology can communicate with the industry, until we get those basics done, until there are anthropologists sort of widely and consistently informing development projects in the day-to-day sense. But to take the bait anyway, and sort of think about what else could we do if we were sort of expanding the offer of anthropology. I was also thinking about language and discourse, as Raymond sort of alluded to, and about the the technical language and the jargon that we use, and how it relates to practical and sort of field level outcomes in development work. And of course, there's this whole critique of how the jargon that we use sort of reinforces power imbalances within NGOs. That our colleagues from the Global South have to learn the technical language of the Global North, and then technical expertise sort of invent and reinvent themselves, and they sort of continue the dominance of a very northern set of understandings of the right way of doing things. Not just with hard expertise like agronomy or forestry, epidemiology, I don't know, but also managerial things, softer things, proposal writing, reporting, project management, maybe terms of reference like Raymond was mentioning. So the scope of what success and failure look like at the practical level is really shaped by the technical language we use, and the technical experts keep themselves employed by calling on that language. And there's always this sort of new language that our southern colleagues have to learn from the big northern dictionary to be able to survive in the industry. And then the counter argument, of course, is that the technical language that we're talking about, and all the ways of working that go with it, things like the log frame, the theory of change, and all of the participatory research tools that we use, they give us a common language for working across cultures, and a set of sort of commonly understood definitions that act as a point of reference in an otherwise really muddy and chaotic sort of web of communication. So it could be as empowering as it is disempowering. And I think anthropology has a lot to offer to how we navigate that argument. Of course, a lot of anthropology, or all of anthropology, yes, historically had to do with language and with discourse, and how the structure of the language we use sort of shapes possibilities. In this case, how it shapes development outcomes. Yeah, so I think that looking critically at language and discourse is something that anthropology can still do really on a practical level. We can really work on how the international language in development sort of rubs up against local or beneficiary conceptualizations and understandings. And what happens to local understandings, to local meanings, when there aren't available cognate terms, when things like capacity building don't quite translate properly. In a log frame, for example, we use technical definitions of our outcomes, and we work towards them. We tick off when things are done, 400 farmers trained, tick. But how does that representation of a successful outcome sort of line up with a local conceptualizing of what success would be? In development, we tend to go to the field and do evaluations to answer that question. And sometimes we hire anthropologists for that. But we always end up translating what the beneficiaries tell us about that sort of back into the technical language of the log frame, and writing reports that have as their point of comparison the outcomes that we've expressed in the log frame. But we could also be looking at the log frame itself and the other technical tools that we use in planning and implementing projects. And how appropriate are those? How are they on the money for sort of local conceptualizations or understandings, definitions of what success would be? So that would be a task for anthropology it's still part of project delivery, but for me, it's also just a step removed from the cut and thrust of implementation. But because it's a policy contribution as well. It would help us to look again critically at the tools and the reporting requirements that the donors and the UN system use. I'll conclude quickly, actually. I spoke quicker than I expected, sorry. I think this is already relevant right now because of the localization agenda. This is a time when we're all trying to shift power away from the global north and to find really new ways of working together across cultures without the northern partner always setting the agenda. And I feel like we always fall into this trap where no matter what you try, the northern partner ends up setting the agenda anyway. And that's maybe something that anthropology can come and sort of work on by looking at the base tools that we use in the field and communicating sort of to NGOs and to the UN about how those tools and those reporting requirements fall short, and what local sort of parallels or alternatives might be. And that's something that I think, again, can really help sort of practically with making localization work properly. I'll maybe leave it there.
Thank you very, very much, Alex. While I take your point about the shortage of anthropologists, I can't resist countering it with the fact that there are a huge number of anthropologists in some countries in the global south, notably India. I know Somaliland's rather far from India, but actually there are quite a number in anthropology in Ethiopia. There's an association for anthropologists and sociologists there, so there's quite a large number. And I also, apologies, forgive me, but I can't resist mentioning that Richard Axelby, who's also here, and I have been running a program which is giving grants to scholars in Myanmar and Ethiopia, and quite a number of them in Ethiopia are anthropologists. But I do think UK universities could do a lot more to work in coalition with more genuinely in coalition rather than just contracting colleagues in places like Ethiopia. So if that's something of interest to people, it'd be great to come back to that as well. But I'm now going to bring in colleagues from the audience. So could I begin with Gerard Solole? Please go ahead and answer and ask your question or make your comment.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thanks very much. I'm a lapsed anthropologist, if anything, and I come from the global south. I grew up in Ethiopia, studied in Ethiopia, ended up essentially doing my PhD at Manchester many, many years ago. And I've been basically in the development business my entire life, working mostly for Oxfam, Save the Children, Red Barna, et cetera, and then ended up in the philanthropic universe. So I've been doing this all my life. I'm a lapsed anthropologist, but I'm a development worker, and I see myself as that. And I think that some of the things you've raised are really important, but I did sort of react to somebody who I consider a guru saying something about leadership and ruling versus management. And I frankly take exception to that, because I think if anthropology stands for anything at all, it's a recognition that the knowledge exists on the ground, and that you're likely to find better answers if you talk to people and listen to them. And so I take great inspiration from Tim Ingold's recent work on anthropology, where he basically says anthropology does not study people, it studies with people. And it takes advantage of what's known on the ground, because it's the one thing that actually we do differently. And I've always found it extremely helpful to be an anthropologist. I ended up doing my PhD on a European society. So I'm an African anthropologist who studied Europe. And that was many, many years ago. So, and I've always found that in fact, it helped me understand that in fact, there are answers on the ground if you listen adequately to people. And one of the problems I think is in the business now, where foundations and NGOs are beginning really to seriously self-examine their colonial impetus. that actually anthropologists can be extremely helpful in validating community and validating where knowledge really sits. And actually it's an unacademic discipline, which is one of the things that I think anthropologists had to grapple with in its entire life, trying to pretend to be like all the other disciplines when it actually is somewhat, can I say it's ataxic, it's subversive to academia when it's done right. So I'll stop there. I don't want to go on and on, but I'd be very happy to talk to anybody who's interested in these things. And I mean, frankly, somebody just wrote something about the word beneficiary. I wrote something many years ago about the taxation of the beneficiary, which came from the Sussex school, where they were doing all these focus group interviews. And I did end up hiring an anthropologist. I was then the director of Save the Children in Zimbabwe. And we had a community that clearly things were going wrong. And so I asked an anthropologist to come and tell me what was going wrong. And she then ended up coming back, and she was a Zimbabwean anthropologist. And she said, you know what, the NGOs, there are 27 organizations that are all making demands on this same village in terms of their time. And she ended up saying, you know what they were doing was they were sending actually the imbeciles to the meetings because they could not afford to take any more time from their own work to be able to answer all the agricultural, health, and others that were asking for focus group interviews and trying to ask people for their time. And these things do matter. And I think anthropology does have something to offer in this context. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope I'm not muted. Yes, thank you so much, Gerard. You're living proof of my claim that there are talented anthropologists in or from Ethiopia. But I think you raise a really important point about various hierarchies. And I do think that any anthropological training that I know about does, on the one hand, try and draw attention to these. But then what's really interesting is how common it is when people are actually working in practice for the kind of sharp focus on hierarchies to dissipate under the pressure of getting things done, or, the incentives for claiming funding or credit or whatever for oneself or for one's institution. So I think you raised some really, really important points, and I'd like to get into this. But first of all, can I give the panel a chance to pitch in? Going back to Raymond. Raymond, would you like to respond?
Only one or two words. Am I on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Am I mute?
Yes.
Okay. My interesting discussion about ruling and advising, I was merely talking about the role of a consultant and how to maximize what anthropology could offer through the consultancy. And that's where I wanted to distinguish between advising and ruling. It wasn't that finally you couldn't have a prime minister who was an anthropologist. It was rather it was not that. It was just to maximize communicating anthropology through consultancy. And I'm still limiting myself to development, not humanitarian, because we've got September to specialize in humanitarian later on. So that was my point. How can anthropology best show off its talents? And I think that is by being more conjectural. Anthropology will have to change. It will have to learn to predict a bit. There's very little emphasis in anthropology on prediction at the moment. But if one's going to come up with scenarios, interventions, and what is likely to happen, then anthropology has to get moving on. It has to get moving and studying, thinking about prediction. The other thing, next point, I don't think anthropologists should claim too much. They shouldn't. Anthropologists, for one thing, are very bad team players, even with anthropologists. I mean, anthropologists tend to be by themselves. They tend to be anti-team. Of course, there are exceptions. Anthropologists who are husband and wife somehow seem to get on very well, although they might separate afterwards. But anthropologists don't even work with other anthropologists. So the first thing to do is to have an ethic of joining a team, because then negotiating your knowledge rather than waiting to deliver it, to unload it in a bottom line best solution at the very end. Thirdly, localization is very important, but I don't want to box anthropology into merely localization, particularly as localization is, it's very unclear really what is meant. I noticed just now, Alex put it in terms of decreasing the North in the South. There's so many ways of reading or unreading localization. And we don't want anthropology to go back to field studies and village studies. Anthropology, the field for anthropology is offices, it's organizations. It's not the local, it's the international, it's as much the international as the local, and that shouldn't be left. And then finally, it's very important. The anthropologists do because they work, let's say, on the ground, but it could be in a village, it could be in an office, but there's the empirical tradition. They come up with what seems to them very evident. But before what is evident to an anthropologist is acceptable as evidence to an organization, there's a huge process involved. And I think when I'm talking about anthropology being anthropology of communication, it's not just data delivery and data management, it's messaging about data. And I agree with Alex that anthropology actually can do that. I think it can do this messaging work quite well, but it doesn't do enough of it at present. I better stop there, but I could go on for a little bit more. Very interesting discussion.
Amy.
Yes, thanks so much, Gerard, for your comments and insights. Really good to hear those reflections, and just to pick up on two of the points that you said. I think in being subversive, I think that's what also the role of the anthropologist within the sector can be, not only within academia, but within the organizations they operate in, and to question, how things are done, why things are done on a continuous basis in a constructive way. And then also your point on focus group discussions and being over researched. I think that is such a big issue, and I think that actually what that reveals is how little trust there is amongst development and humanitarian organizations, and how much the insistence is from donors or from project perspective to collect that data, to be able to have a baseline and an end line of a project, and that you can't use other people's data to do that. Oxfam can't use Save the Children's baseline assessment because we have to do our own, because we have our own projects. And that's a total nonsense, right? But somehow actually it reveals, the structural issues of the kind of interaction between the agencies, and also the limits of the methodologies that are used over and over by development and humanitarian organizations. It's key informed interviews, focus group discussions, surveys. Those are the only research tools that are used. Whereas you would probably, if you got an anthropologist to sit in an IDP camp or a village and just observe for a week, you would get richer data than by having that kind of the same kind of data collection over and over again. Thanks.
Amy, what before I come to Alex, there's a specific question for you which is related to this, which is from Lav Canoy. Curious about how anthropologists might be empowered to question, leave alone, let alone negotiate hierarchical power structures that they may be earning their bread from and be dependent on?
Yes, great question. Well, I think I've struggled with this a little bit because before I joined kind of international development organizations, I worked for a lot of co-ops with very flat hierarchical structures. So it was a bit of a shock to then be in an organization that has very has levels, and I think what helps is to know when the hierarchy matters and when it doesn't, and that you don't have to follow it for the most part. You know, yes, you need sign off for different things, and there are certain people who make decisions, but for the day-to-day work, you can subvert it basically. I think also I've been quite lucky with my roles in being either a researcher or someone who works in advocacy, because we tend to operate as kind of loners within the structure and within a network of other people with the same positions in other contexts. So we have people who we can get advice from, or kind of have brainstorming sessions with, but we don't need to, we kind of have access to that. And I think the other ways are, you know, by formal review of those hierarchical structures, like what function, who should be in the senior management team, and what should the pay scales be, and does that position need to be an international position, or can it be a national position, and maybe have you know, someone who's sitting who has international experience advising them or being their mentor. I think you can use those opportunities to question that. But of course, yeah, you also need to find a job, and you need to come with the skills and experience that you offer, and hope that that gets you a job. But yeah, I for me anyway, also I feel like there's careers are so long and there's so much pressure to progress quickly, and I just don't think you need to do it that quickly. You can take your time and to stay in a job for a while, or stay at a different level for a while, without following the race.
Yeah, thanks. Alex, did you have something to add to this? And then I've got some more questions for you.
I wish I was secure enough in my job to be subversive. Maybe I'm not that good, but I would certainly echo and welcome what Gerard said. It's a really, really useful point. It also, I think Amy sort of touched on it again as well, that the distinction between justification and evidence, that we go into our research within a development organization, honestly, most of the time knowing what outcome we want, because we've got a proposal to write, and we know what the end of the log frame looks like. We need to fill in the gaps at the beginning. If you were to send an anthropologist to an IDP camp for a few months, you would get sort of more real evidence, but that would make it harder, I think, for the non-anthropologists around you to get their proposal written on time. And there's always this struggle between the day-to-day demand and the pace of fieldwork and the veracity of our methods.
Yeah, Alex, still with you. We've got a few questions about language. If we can carry on with that, we'll go back to that theme a bit more. So yes, this difficulty of challenging language and subverting language, I would try and continually say to my colleagues when I used to work in NGOs, yeah, beneficiaries is just not really very honest, is it? Let's talk about the people who we're working with. Some of them may be left out, some of them may be harmed, but you know, this fantasy that they're all beneficiaries, blah, blah, blah. But then I'd get accused of being academic all the time. And, you know, the implication was that by challenging language, I was off the main priority. It wasn't the most important thing to be discussing. So, but also I've got two other questions in the chat about this language stuff. Hi, Alex, your comment that colleagues from the Global South have to learn to use the technical language of the Global North sounds like this is related to ideas about indigenizing and decolonizing policy and practice. What has been your experience between enacting and communicating ideas like these to supervisors and to other people in power. And because of Zoom, forgive me, I'm going to give you the other one as well because it's simpler. So this one is from Lav. That one was from Hannah Gibbs, but this one's from Lav Kanoi. Also curious about Alex's distinction between justification and evidence and how far one can claim objective status for the latter. If you could give us your thoughts on that, that'd be brilliant.
Sorry, Emma, could you repeat the first question because my connection wobbled?
Oh yeah, sure. The first one was, given that people in the Global South have to learn the technical language that's often promoted, particularly in the Global North or created in the Global North, how does this relate to ideas about indigenizing and decolonizing policy and practice? And what has been your experience between enacting and communicating ideas like this to supervisors and other people in power?
Yeah, okay. For would be a really useful shorthand for.
Sorry, Alex, I'm really sorry. Can you say that again?
Because I think sort of decolonization is a.
Can you say that again? Because your internet was a bit wobbly.
Okay. Do you hear me well now?
Yeah, now it's better.
Sure. Yeah, decolonization would be the perfect shorthand for what I was talking about and what I was aiming for. And I wonder if now is really the time for talking about decolonization. It's a much less scary word since the last year or two, I think, for the industry. So yeah, I should have thought of that. Useful terminology. My own experience wouldn't really go any further than that. In the day-to-day of my work, I'm often the European manager of a field team of staff, mostly from the Global South, and the opportunities that I see to sort of work on this, on addressing the language that we use and the technical tools that we use, is sort of as an intermediary. And I've had a couple of projects where I've worked with really young teams, and it's been a lot of fun to sort of play the role of embedding myself in a field team. I'm thinking of a field team in Myanmar, and then acting as the interpreter, right, and sort of trying to unpack with my field team as much as possible what is the donor thinking, what's happening in the meeting room behind the curtain in UNOCHA, as it was in that case. That's the best I've been able to do. I've never really sensed any appetite amongst my superiors. I think that's what the question was, for really working on this. Okay, and second question, justification versus evidence. Yeah, there's I think unless you are working with people from your own discipline, I've never had a team with other anthropologists on it. I always work with technical people, and I think that, sorry to generalize, but it might be that the technical people within development, perhaps of a particular generation, are less attuned to a distinction between justification and evidence, or understand less about research methods because they're an agronomist or an engineer or a hard science that has a right way and a wrong way. So you always work with justification. You don't understand the sort of the possibility of the truth that you're producing being disputable. In Somaliland and across the Horn of Africa, there's a cat. It's a narcotic leaf that lots of people are addicted to, and it's very addictive, and it's quite debilitating. If you are addicted to it, you get insomnia, and you get family life can break down because of cat addictions. And there's a perception that everybody in Somaliland is addicted to cat, that all adult men are consumed by it, and it has an implication for the work that we do as NGOs, because you forget setting up a village savings association because all the money will get spent on cat, right? These kinds of things. When you do women's groups, you have to be really careful to make sure that men aren't pulling the strings behind the scenes to take money and spend it on cat. And I've always had the suspicion that cat addiction is not as widespread as the evidence suggests. And one day when I've got more time, I want to do some anthropology on how do people really use cat. We understand that every adult man buys some cat when they receive some cash from an NGO, but we don't know if they're really addicted to it, really, if it consumes their life in the same way that nicotine does, for example. Yeah? So that for me would be a sort of where the distinction is meaningful between justification for your project outcome, because you don't want to do a project, or you do want to do a project because of this perception of cat addiction, and evidence for how it really works.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a very long answer.
No, that's really interesting. Some really good sociological work about the use of chat in Ethiopia by the Forum for Social Studies. That I'm just giving examples of good anthropological work or sociological work by colleagues in Global South. Pedro, would you like to ask your question, please, or comment?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'm a PhD student in social anthropology at the University of Manchester, but also from the Global South and from Brazil. So I just want to ask a question that I think might shift the discussion a little bit, but just an issue that I'm really interested in hearing about. I was just wondering, are we past the moment when development organizations have been a bit weary of anthropological critique? Are we past the David Moss moment? And how do you address these tensions created by critique in anthropology in communication with development organizations? So I'll just share my own experience, my own recent experience. I'm doing my PhD fieldwork in Brazil with the International Committee of the Red Cross. And recently there was an opportunity to do a consultancy with them in another project with a team based in Geneva. And I heard from my main contact in the organization that the reason why they did not want to give me the consultancy was because they were afraid that I would conflate the consultancy with my PhD research, that they were afraid that I wouldn't end up writing about the team in my own PhD work, conflating the two things. So how do you address that? Thank you.
I think this is an incredibly important issue in various domains. It's getting increasingly difficult to do research with politicians for similar reasons, I find. So I think this is a really important issue. Raymond, would you like to address this one?
Well, getting a contract is always very difficult, whether you're an anthropologist or not. And if the anthropologist is marketing himself or herself as a subversive, then of course he's not going to get a contract. I think it's a bit unfair to accuse Pedro or to suspect that Pedro will then just write his thesis. Could be the other way around. You could do the consultancy and then borrow from that into the thesis. It's a bit unfair to say it's the other way around. But that's one of my points about the comparative method, isn't it? Also the point about tobacco and hash. And you make the anthropologist can make the comparison, but then that's immediately written off as some kind of aberrant cultural relativism. where that wasn't the point. I mean, and also anthropology is not very good at marketing itself. Anthropology, I'm going to offer this: ethnographics, forensics, economics, but there are no anthropologics. Do you see my point? There's very little system work in anthropology, particularly the Anglo sort. There's much more in France, obviously. And if there are no icks, I mean, the ickification, until anthropology ickifies, is going to be just ethnography. And there's a big difference between ethnography and anthropology, although, I mean, they're both important, but there's a difference between the two. I mean, if one was trying to get the contract, I would advise you as an advisor, just an advisor, to market yourself as an ethnographer, not as an anthropologist, and probably to downplay what you can offer. And then what you will get for that, for your thesis, is access to the organization, which normally you can't get. And that gives you a remarkably valuable area of source that you wouldn't otherwise have. So I would say persist, persist, persist. But you see, also anthropologists, as I said, are not regarded as team players. They're not team players. So you want also to sell yourself as a team player. It's very difficult, very difficult. Can I give one anecdote? Many, many years ago, it might have been the first time that I managed to get an anthropologist employed by one of the UN organizations. It was the UNDP, but I'm not going to mention that in writing. And there I was trying to negotiate. I wanted an anthropologist. I was working for another UN organization at the time. I wanted an anthropologist in my project. I went to New York. You can't have an anthropologist. You can have an economist. Well, then I said, well, I want an economic anthropologist. And the person I was negotiating with, who was a very wily negotiator, as I was trying to be as well, said, you mean a cheap anthropologist? You can have a cheap anthropologist, but that would cost us less than an economist. That was the only way, and it might have been the first time that an anthropologist was actually employed as such by the UN. There may have been a previous case of which I'm unaware. That was the case I happened to be involved in myself. So, sympathies, mate. Very difficult, but don't give up.
Amy, I think you have something, and then I'm going to go to another question.
Yeah, Pedro, that sounds like Raymond's saying. That sounds really unfortunate as an outcome. And I don't know. I think I was speaking to a colleague of mine recently who is thinking or considering hiring an anthropologist to look at kind of the way that the debate is happening around the kind of sexual exploitation debates within organizations in DRC, and that's why I also mentioned that the points at which there's disruption, I think that then there is a really open invitation to that critical perspective, because it's when people who are in that situation are seeking out new perspectives, are seeking out a clear critique of what is going wrong. So I think that in that sense, there's not a wariness, but an openness towards anthropologists and critical perspectives. But yeah, I could see how in other situations, maybe what Alex was mentioning earlier, where then it's a matter, or what also Raymond, you were saying in terms of needing a clear recommendation, that becomes very difficult if you have someone who is open to surprises in a way that that may invite a whole new understanding of an issue. Then it may be more difficult to actually translate that into operationalizing those recommendations or those insights. So I guess that's where the wariness comes in.
Well, I would say that wasn't the job of the consultant. We're talking about management consultancy. Let somebody else do the operationalizing. Let's try to maximize the anthropology you can get into a consultancy. That was the topic that I thought we had, for this session. Anyway, I understand.
there's a question that's very relevant to that, Raymond. So this one's particularly for you, I think, but others, Alex or Amy, might want to come in. So here we go.
Yes.
There's one from Robert McDowell. Solution comes in two forms: new solutions and solutions in progress. Most contracts should or do enable articulation of both. Progress to date should always be evaluated and included in any messaging in order to provide balance in any messaging. And the second question, so I think Robert's inviting your comments on that. The second part of his question is, new solutions need to demonstrate practicability in terms of assessment of costs, resources, timing, monitoring, and risks, if they are to be effective messages. So do you agree, disagree, or any comments on those two? They're in the chat, but they're quite far, they're very high up in the chat if you want to have a look.
Just a quick comment. Thank you, Robert. Solutions, puzzles have single solutions. There's only one way of completing a puzzle. Unfortunately, not all problems are puzzles. So it's not a solution always as necessary or possible. If all problems were puzzles, then you could go for solutions. But most public policy problems are not puzzles, they're problems. And then the second point, how practical should your advice be? Of course, it should be as practical as possible. But most anthropologists are hopeless at that because they have no other experience. They are merely anthropologists. It may sound funny coming from the ONSEC of the Royal Anthropological Institute, but the point is that unless you are more than an anthropologist, it's come out so strongly, both from Alex and from Amy, you must have a sectoral specialization. If you don't have that, go home. You don't expect anything, because you're the wrong person for that particular assignment. I think that was the point that I made. The other thing is that don't forget, keep your advisor role, let the ruler come up with particularly practicality issues. I mean, obviously you won't give too abstract, your advice won't be abstract. Ideally, a menu of options. If you do this, the anthropological advice is that that might happen as a result. Offer problems are not puzzles, so then they're not in search of solutions. Offer a menu of options, and that might work as maximizing your anthropological contribution. It's not a very clear answer, but it's just a few comments.
No, I found it very clear. We've now got a lot of questions, and it's always nice to hear other voices as well. So
Yes.
if Joy Hendry would, if you'd very kindly put your question or comment at this point, that'd be great. Then I'll try and cover some of the written questions as well in a minute.
Yeah, that's fine. I can do that. Sorry, I was just away getting my coffee. I think that your idea of having an anthropologist employed in every organization is wonderful, but I was a little concerned that both Alex and Amy, I think, if I heard it right, said that you're not employed as an anthropologist and you don't mention very often that you are an anthropologist. And I think that's a real shame, because I've worked in Japan with people who think anthropology is great, and with indigenous people in North America and other parts of the world who didn't. And what I always did was I started out without saying I was an anthropologist and then gradually introduced it. And I think I've actually convinced a few people that what I do is, as an anthropologist, is better than they thought anthropology was when I started. So I mean, this is ordinary research. I'm not in management consultancy, but I have worked in Oxford for a management consultancy that didn't know what anthropologists did. And I found out about it through a friend who said, will you come and talk to us? And they were amazed at what we do. So my question is really, how can we make, I mean, the comment from Ethiopia was wonderful. It was just great to hear what anthropologists in other parts of the world are doing. And I just wonder how we can make it a more positive thing for people to talk about. You know, it's all very well me sitting in the pub and saying, I'm an anthropologist and I do this, but you people at the front line working, how can you use our word, maybe making it anthropologics, as Raymond suggested, is one idea, but it's got such a mixed review around the world, and we do get a bit of a reputation for being too academic, which I try very hard not to be in my own world, but what can we do? Because people are doing such good things around the world as anthropologists and in management consultancy and all sorts of other fields. How can we make our subject a more positive thing for people to think about, is my question, really.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Joy. I'm going to come first to Alex in a moment, but there's another question which relates to this. I'm sorry to do this, but you know what it's like with Zoom. It's kind of simpler to bunch things together. So the related question from Dustin Barter is, I wonder how much anthropology is needed, or is it just that development organizations need to listen better to national people and staff within their organization or partner organizations? Every context I've worked in, national, colleagues, or broader public, have a far more nuanced and comprehensive understanding of what's going on. But organizations often tend to not put enough effort into listening or foregrounding knowledge. So is an anthropologist perhaps just reinforcing this notion of external expertise being necessary, and thus reinforcing hierarchy, neo-colonialism, etc., when the localized expertise is already there, just not listened to and or ignored? So really, yeah, quite contrasting. I mean, both these points can be true, actually, I think, at the same time, but really interesting contrast to what Joy was saying. So Alex, what would you like to react to that?
Thanks. On the first question, I think that the rest of the world sort of lost track of what anthropology is about 100 years ago. And if you mention that you're an anthropologist in development, I think the impression that people would get is that you're going to go in and sort of Malinowski things and try to come up with prescriptive solutions in the same way that an engineer or a medical doctor might do.
So you need to change that, Alex.
Yeah,
it's your job.
Yeah, I found okay, being for context about 10 years into my career and having started out in the aftermath of the financial crisis, 2008, the job market itself was difficult, and that's why I talked about the cut and thrust a bit. And I think that our tendency as young professionals is to try and ride the wave of whatever the trend is, and the trend has been quantitative for as long as I've known it. And I've sort of after I graduated, I spent some time catching up and learning what the industry does. Not learning how to apply anthropology to it, but learning about agronomy and agroforestry and things like this. And it's only now in the last couple of years that I find myself able to stop and breathe and sort of bring anthropology back in. And I'm lucky sort of to work on a team with two older agronomists who often say that they wish they trained as anthropologists. So we have a nice dialogue between us. We're quite lucky in that sense. But the reason that we can't just change it, I think, is because of the pressure on our employability. Yeah. On Dustin's point about listening to national staff, absolutely, that's sort of what the challenge is. That's what the industry needs to do. I don't know if it's quite enough, because if you have a room full of experts and there are international project managers, proposal writers, these kinds of things, and then national technical staff, that's often how things go. I don't think it's just about listening. I think it's about translating, or maybe about transliterating. Right? Would a Somali translator or a bilingual project manager be enough? Or is there work for us to do in transferring local knowledge to the sort of international context that development happens in? I think there's a bit more to it than just listening. So I don't know if only anthropologists could do that, but I think it's something that anthropologists could do.
Thank you, Alex. I'm going to come to Amy and then Raymond, but I just want to pitch in as well some interesting stuff from the chat. Peter Oakley points out the discussion seems to have a very unproblematic notion of what it means to be an anthropologist. It means different things in Japan, North America, different parts of Europe, and so forth. And then others agree. But Joy Hendry points out, yes, of course, that is the problem, but then people seem to think they know what economics is. So, Amy, respond to any of that mix that you feel like.
Yeah, maybe to Joy's question, yes, I do talk about being an anthropologist, and it's funny because often the reaction is, oh yeah, you know, I had a friend of mine had some Danish woman live with her for a year who was an anthropologist. It's always like some, you know, someone who has been outside of the development industry that maybe they've heard of an anthropologist as an ethnographer who's studying, you know, something and didn't behave in the same way, I guess, as a development worker does, because they're not associated with a particular organization. So I think, and there is curiosity about what anthropology is, and yeah, and I think when I like to mention that the anthropology or the master's degree that I did is also understanding the culture of the development sector and the development industry, rather than an anthropologist of you know, the local community that a development organization may work in, but of the sector itself. Maybe that kind of goes nicely to Dustin's question also. Yeah, absolutely. I think the problem is that development and humanitarian organizations are, you know, are under pressure to deliver things on time, are donor driven, have a lot on, and so listening, noticing, questioning are not things that there is inbuilt time for, and so the kind of operation of the organization doesn't often allow for that mode, I guess, for that reflective and critical perspective, which would allow to open up the conversation and to ask questions more openly of national staff, of people that are around that might have that broader perspective. I don't know whether anthropologists, if there was an anthropologist in every organization, whether there would be that kind of function built in. It may also, in the same way that like a gender position means that then that person is the one who deals with women's things and no one else has to think about gender. So maybe the anthropologist would be like chief listening officer, and no one else needs to question and listen. But if there was a kind of more of an emphasis or tools to listen and to question and to analyze in a way that anthropology offers, then I think that would be awesome. And maybe that would be something that could come from the top down. If that was something that donors pushed for, organizations would have to respond in a way that they don't to kind of internal pressures. Yeah.
Great. Do you want to say something here, Raymond, or shall I give you a couple more questions?
Yes, later on. Let's hear somebody else from.
Okay.
We've got 200 people here, I think.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of questions. I'm going to bundle together some questions, but you know, if anybody would like to put them to the panel themselves, then don't forget to put your hand up or let me know. But I'm assuming that if you write them in the chat, then I just present them. So there's a bunch of questions which are sort of about more about, in a way, what anthropology is, but and or what it offers, how we can explain it to people, the value of it. So I'll start with Vanessa Cantino de Jesus. I'm sorry, I'm so bad at pronouncing names. Vanessa asks, I wonder what the role of academia in teaching anthropologists what to be is. I've often found that critical and relativistic ethos I was taught leads to an incapability on being practical in applied settings. And it leaves people ill-equipped to defend the ground to criticisms of being overly academic. So I can really relate to that. Hannah Pitt asks for any positive stories. I can't find it, but she was asking, what positive stories have you got of anthropologists working in a way that was recognized as valuable within organizations? And then the third question was from my colleague Jacinda Kaur, which is picking up on themes of localization and what Alex said about riding the quant wave in order to vie for relevance and development. What strategies should we be deploying to influence and reshape development funders' expectations about impact outcomes, especially, to draw on just one example I'm familiar with, in the context of often deep local diversity and disagreement about what development is and how to make change happen? Also, could we hear more from Raymond about developing a comparative method in anthropology? So if you'd all like to respond on that really fascinating mixture of the value of anthropology, how we can be comparative, and also how we teach anthropology in a way that can be critical and attentive to context, but can also be practical. So that sort of in that area. If Raymond, if you'd like to begin.
Thank you. Just a few quick comments, not really answers, but a few quick comments. Comparative method. The best person to ask is not me about comparative method. It's Matteo Candea at Cambridge, who's just written the book. Trouble is, I'm stuck in Sydney in Australia at the moment, and my library is in London, and I can't get out because the national borders won't open until August, September, or October, apparently. So I haven't got the book in front of me, but his conclusion was, he quotes Evans Pritchard quite a lot, that it's what's most desirable, but it's what's most impossible in anthropology. So I think what I'm doing is recognizing it's very difficult, it hasn't been done, but without it, we're not going to have anthropographics. We're going to be, yeah. On the, I think it was Dustin, one of Dustin's comments about independent experts, I think rather than just say there's nothing, that independent experts, don't forget, we're only focusing on one mode of communication for this panel, not select committees, that was before, that's easy, but on management consultancy. And in that sense, there is a role for independent experts to be hired. And anthropological experts, let's include those. But what is it they can do and what is it they can't do? And I mean, what I could tell from my own experience is that what an independent expert hired as such can do is draw conclusions from such sightings as a team has made over a month or two, however long the consultancy was. And that is drawing the conclusions from what you've sort of observed, what you call findings, but are more like sightings. That is very much for an independent, neutral, impartial, external person to do. But when it comes to making recommendations again, my own experience in West Africa was one member of one of my teams simply quit. He says, Raymond, we're working for, it was in that case the ILO. I've written this up as a long case study published years ago in French and English and Spanish as well as English, as a matter of fact, when John Walton and I were at ALNAP. And this member of my team, I had a team of 6 or 7, he quit. He said, Raymond, you've never worked for, it was the ILO, so I'm not going to stay on this mission anymore because you will not know how to make recommendations. This actually comes back a little bit to Robert's point that you want to make a recommendation that at least will be heard. And to do that, it's better not to be an independent expert. It's better to have some internal knowledge and experience of the organization itself. So I think there is a role, but it may be a limited role for independent experts. National staff, one has to be very careful about national staff these days in these big organizations. They're so big that national staff have been socialized into these big organizations. They're no longer national. They're now part of the international cohort. And the worst thing, sorry, Alex, forgive me, this is just my comment from my experience. The worst thing would be to entrust localization to national experts in an international organization, be it non-governmental or governmental. You won't get it. What you will get is the usual stuff. You won't get something from below or from the country concerned. And then, you know, if I can make it one more point, what is anthropology? I mean, I've tried to argue that anthropology, to perform this role, we're only talking about the role of anthropology in a management consultancy this evening, that's all, or this morning in your case. For me, it's night, I think, but we're only talking about that. And in that role, I made the point that the anthropology that the last 50 years isn't good enough to perform what it could do in that way unless it changes. So that is, I think, an area where the anthropology has to change. It's not at the moment very well equipped to perform any role, advisory role in a consultancy of a management consultancy nature. What flashed to mind was Tim Emgold's definition of anthropology. I mean, it's another definition of anthropology, but it's a very interesting one. It's philosophy with the people in it. And when you think of all this academic moral philosophy, which doesn't have the people in it, except the academics in Oxford or Cambridge or Manchester or wherever it is, or Makerere, or wherever it is, they're not in it. And I mean, that really, you know, finally, that is it. It's the people. It's philosophy with the people in it. I think it's a very good definition. I mean, I'm sure there are other very good definitions as well. But the people are us as well as them. They're not just, I mean, Emma in particular is so aware of this through her work. For example, it's us. It's that's why I think we should have some anthropology of the anthropology of policy, the anthropology of the communication of the anthropology of policy, because we're communicating really to ourselves, others in our groups, our class, us rather than them. And anthropology isn't equipped for that yet. It will if it could focus on messaging. That's my little marketing point for this evening, but it hasn't done that yet. Yes, individual words, beneficiary, that's really a terrible word. It's because it assumes people are benefiting from what's happening. Also, lessons learned is a terrible phrase. All it means is that the lessons, we're talking about advisory consultancies. It means that a consultant or a team has identified a lesson and calls it a lesson learned by the team, maybe, but whether it ever would be learned by the agency is another matter altogether. So we can easily go down individual words in the vocabulary, That's the language side. But I think we have to go a bit further. It's not just what data we give, it's what message we give about the data that we are putting on the table. And that is another step. And that I actually agree with Alex, is something anthropology, when reformed, could do very well. Perhaps better than any other single discipline. But finally, it's interdisciplinary teamwork that's the essential point. And anthropologists have to find a way of working in that way.
That was fantastic. That was fantastic, Raymond. You've reminded me that some of the language in development makes one feel like one's at school, and that's quite irritating. Like
yes,
yes. Other aspects of the language make one feel like one's in the military, sort of targets and whatnot. Yes. So I think some of the stuff that we've learned about language is very interesting. In a moment, I'm going to come to Alex, and then I'm going to give the last word to Amy as a good feminist. But I just want to give one positive example to respond to Hannah's question about anthropology being positive, or the value of anthropology being positive. It may be a little bit of a stretch to say this was me in my anthropological mode, but I would like to make the argument that when I was asked to as a consultant, to advise on setting up the first big lottery fund international program, I developed the priorities by talking to as many people as I could in the sector. And I basically analyzed the kind of chain of relationships or the configuration of relationships in the aid industry. And I said to the big lottery, it's not up to you to decide what the content of this work should be. It should be decided by nationals and locals in the countries concerned. So you must keep it very, very open. And I think that was because I applied an aspect of one's anthropological training, which is that you should try and listen to, you should try and take account of as much plurality as possible and understand the impact people are having on each other. But the other thing I did when I got to presenting it to the person who commissioned this, he said, right, how much do you want to ask the board for? I'm thinking about 15 million a year. And I thought, well, and I said, well, why? And he said, because I think that's what we'll get. And I thought, well, no, when you buy a carpet, you never offer what your final amount is going to be. There's a haggling here. So I did a power analysis, worked out that this guy didn't want to upset the board, so he didn't want to ask for too much. I didn't want any more work with this organization, so I thought I can take a risk. So I asked for 50 million and got 30. I think that was anthropological. I'm now going to hand over to Alex, and then to Amy, and then just make a final announcement about future events. Alex.
Well, we're out of time, but I really would have liked to hear more from Raymond about how localization can't come from below, as you put it, or
no, it can come from below, but not from national staff.
Well, yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted. I beg your pardon. Sorry, I should mute myself.
I didn't have anything more to say than to ask you to tell us in maybe a minute or so what do you mean? Tell us more, because I think I disagree.
Are you happy to just respond to that point, Raymond? Because I agree. I think it's interesting. Yeah,
it's a very important point, and I mean, my experience may be completely off the planet. My experience with national staff of big organizations is they're no longer national in their orientation or loyalties. They've been socialized into the big organization. Their objective is to go up rather than out or down. And I actually wrote an internal report on that for the UN some years ago, because the UN was promoting national staff. I thought for the wrong reasons. I mean, the other reason is, as I said before, it's not capacity building, it's it's lowering barriers to capacity. That's the reason to have national staff. You bring the national staff in, you lower the barrier. Normally they can't get in, but you lower the barriers, they come in because they have the capacity. That was my point earlier. That would be an example of the point earlier. But then to assign to the national staff, it's like Amy said, Oh, I've had so much trouble with this. You know, a woman, oh, it's gender, oh, give it to her. I mean, when I started gender teaching in The Hague in Holland many years ago, of course, we employed a very distinguished Maria Mies as professor, but of course I offered to teach as well, male though I may be. She said, oh, welcome. Oh, that is very unusual, apparently. And within the UN, the number of women who said to me, Raymond, I'm just condemned to gender. How can I get around it? If only I hadn't left the UN and become an academic again, I might have been able within the system to have done something about it, because I felt very strongly about it. What else would I say?
No, that's brilliant, Raymond. I think we've only got time for a final comment from Amy, but I do think this topic of how anthropologists can learn from feminists about how not to be marginalized is a really interesting one, possibly worthy of a whole other event. But Amy, can I give you the last word, and then I'm just going to make one quick announcement.
Thanks. Yeah, so many ideas and things that we could talk about. Just to maybe come back to some of the questions that you raised earlier, Emma, or read out from the chat. I think the teaching anthropology and coming away feeling like you have less practical knowledge. I definitely also had that sense. I also felt like we had deconstructed development and aid so much that it kind of ripped the carpet from underneath my feet, and it took a while to rebuild, to be like, okay, of all of the industries in the world, is development and aid the worst? Probably not. And you know, it was really good to critically analyze them, but I still want to work for those organizations. And it has, though, over time, those critiques that we learned in those courses have been extremely useful to be able to name things that are, as I think someone else said earlier, uncomfortable knowledge. Maybe it was you, Pedro. That it's easier to articulate those things that you experience in the sector. That you are better able to articulate and raise those questions and critiques, because you've heard them in an academic sense. They have validity, so your experience of the sector is mirrored in those theories, and you can bring those up. I guess in terms of the value of anthropology, maybe because our or the course that I did was much more focused on analyzing the sector rather than using anthropology for development. I think it can also offer kind of this organizational anthropology or a sectoral critique, and being able to work out why organizations and individuals within them are behaving that way, and what pressures they're under, and what kind of structures and incentives need to change their behavior and practice. I guess the other thing to say is that in terms of the language and the value of language, I mean, it's always a really, sometimes I try and use no development jargon for a week. It's so hard. But when I come across someone who does it really well, I think that to me is a bit anthropological, because you're naming the practice, you're naming the behavior, you're naming what someone's actually doing, what actually happened. You know, this and this person went to such and such and said this, and that meant X, Y, Z happened. That wasn't capacity building. You know, that was just a person going up and doing a training, and that led to X, Y, Z. You don't have to, kind of mask it in this development language to feel confident in your own place within the sector. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's very difficult to stop. This pandemic is so boring and so stressful, and this has been a wonderful 2 hours, which has completely helped me forget about it. Can I thank the RAI, and especially Amanda and Haneen for organising this webinar, and for Rich Axelby as well, my colleague from SOAS, who's been involved, and Haneen, involved in the organisation. and especially to the three speakers. Absolutely fascinating. And finally, 2 events to alert you to. The next Anthropology Communicates is on the 11th of February at 3 p.m, 3 to 5, and that one will be about communicating with the media. And there's also a very interesting event on the 22nd of February under the auspices of our Anthropology of Policy and Practice Committee, which is the Anthropology and of the Future. And that will be chaired by Esri Karlbach, who's on our committee as well. So thank you so much for coming, everyone. And thanks again to the speakers.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.